Hello, human geographers. We are back for our next lecture. This is our first video lecture of our 6th unit that is on industrialization and economic development. So let's go ahead and get started. The topic of tonight's lecture is on gender and development. And so we're going to look at several different measures of development and how gender is tied to this. So there's our list of what we're going to look at in the order that we're going to look at it. So we got the Gender Development Index, the GDI. We have the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, and then the Gender Empowerment Measure. We're going to look at each of those and we're going to talk about some of the different elements that are part of that. Now, to get us started with this, in 2015, which was 20 years after a group of 189 countries, so almost every country on earth, developed a plan to try and achieve gender equality. In 2015, 20 years after that, the United Nations came out and said that 0 countries had achieved gender equality. Even the most developed countries on earth had not achieved gender equality. So, what does that mean? Does that impact development? These are questions that we're going to look at today and evaluate their meaning going forward. So we start out with the Gender Development Index, the GDI. And the GDI uses the same indicators as the HDI, the Human Development Index. So, before we go any further, this is a good opportunity for us to review what are the 4 indicators of the Human Development Index. If the GDI uses those same ones, what are we talking about here? So take a moment, press pause, list those 4 indicators, because that's something where I could absolutely see it being of use on a free response question. I could certainly see it being an option on a multiple choice. All of the following are indicators of the Human Development Index, except, and then you have to pick the one exception. Just that number 4 kind of lends itself to that style of question. So take a moment, press pause. What are the 4 indicators? And hopefully you said that those 4 indicators are GNI, which is gross national income per capita. We also have expected years of schooling, average years of schooling, and life expectancy. So the Gender Development Index uses those same 4 indicators of the Human Development Index. However, what it does a little bit differently is compares the difference between men and women in those different indicators. And so what it essentially does is that it penalizes countries on the Gender Development Index that have a large disparity. All right? So countries that have a higher score are countries where genders are more equal. And countries that have a lower score are where the genders are less equal. So let's take a look at what that might be. So this map looks at the Gender-Related Development Index. So first off, let's ask the questions that we always do. First off, what type of map are we looking at? Second, at what scale are we analyzing this information? And third, is this a good indicator of development? Take a look. Is this a good indicator of development? And hopefully you said that yes, it is. All right, so gender equality is something that is associated with higher levels of development. There is a direct connection there, that where genders are more equal, we can see visually here that is correlated with higher levels of development. And where genders are less equal, lower levels of development. All right, so that's why we're talking about this, because it does have an impact on development. So we want to make sure that we know that. Now, in fact, if we were to change the scale a little bit and see, okay, where is it actually the highest? Like within our highest class, where is it actually the highest? We'd actually see that the Gender Development Index is the highest, meaning that the genders are the most equal in Scandinavia, Northern Europe. All right? So make that note. Maybe circle it on your map, Scandinavia, Northern Europe. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland. Hey, that area is where the genders are the most equal. And if you recall, what country was ranked first on the Human Development Index? Were they from Scandinavia? All right. So we're seeing that connection there. We're building that connection. So now let's take a look at some of these components. A lot of tonight is looking at maps and analyzing these maps. So let's take a look. Now, to be clear, this comes from our textbook, which has the old indicators. And so this is looking at school enrollment. It's not looking at average years of education versus expected years of education, which are the new indicators. In this case, it's just looking at school enrollment. All right. So real quick, what are some of the things that catch your eye? Okay, what type of map are we looking at what scale are we analyzing this, and is this a good indicator of development? Can we see variations in levels of development here? And generally speaking, the answer is yes. Now, is this as perfect as the Gender Development Index by itself? No, but take a look in Latin America. Argentina has one of the highest school enrollments of females to males. They're in the highest class. And we already know that Argentina is one of the most developed countries in Latin America. And so that's a good indicator for us. Now this next one, again, is using an old indicator. It's looking at literacy rate. On top, you can see the percentage of males who are literate. And on the bottom map, we can see the percentage of females who are literate. Now, remember that the Gender Development Index penalized countries that have a large disparity between men and women. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is taking a look at the top map, which is men, bottom map, which is women. What countries do you see a disparity in? What countries do you see aren't in the same class? Like the US, men and women are in the same class. Canada in the same class. Russia in the same class. But what areas do we see aren't in the same class? And where are those countries? So take a moment, jot down some of the countries that, looking at top and bottom, aren't in the same class of data. And then what regions of the world are they in? Are they developed regions? Are they developing regions? What are we seeing? All right, so take a moment, jot those down. Those observations are really important. We're thinking like geographers. That's what we want to be doing. And then finally, this one actually still is one of the indicators of the Human Development Index currently. This is looking at life expectancy. Specifically, if you take a look at the legend, which you should always do. On the AP exam, when you get a map, take a look at what the map is actually evaluating. If they give you a legend, make sure that you read it carefully. This one says the number of years that females live longer than males. And so the darkest red is 10 or more years. And then it goes 5 to 9, 3 to 5, below 3. All right. And if you recall from our population unit, we know that women tend to live longer than men. All right. Now, the question in that below 3 category is, could that potentially mean that men are living longer than women? And the answer is yes, it could. But we don't have that raw data in front of us, so it makes it hard to make that assertion. Okay, it's a possibility, but we don't know that for certain. So in taking a look at this, as always, we ask the questions, what type of map are we looking at? What scale? Is this a good indicator of development? And generally speaking, yes, it is. Are there exceptions? Like, yeah, what's happening in Russia? All right, those questions are really, really important. And even if we don't know the answer to it, just by asking the question, we're taking that step. That's geographic inquiry. And so that's important. So take a moment, jot down some of the things that catch your attention, notes, observations, questions that you have. What are some of the things that you notice on this slide? All right, shifting gears now, looking at the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII. Now, if you recall, the Gender Development Index used the same indicators as the Human Development Index. However, the Gender Inequality Index uses other metrics to evaluate the differences between men and women in a country. And so we take a look at it. We have a health indicator looking at maternal mortality rate, that is mothers who die during the course of birth, adolescent fertility rate, so that is younger girls getting pregnant. Okay, what's the rate of that? The empowerment, which is going to look at education, okay, with at least a secondary education. Okay, and then the percentage of, or the share of parliamentary seats. So actual politicians who have the ability to make laws and things like that. All right, and then finally, also the labor participation rate. Now, this one actually has a really nice visual to it, but there's a lot of arrows going in a lot of different directions. So let's break it down. Hey, I'm actually going to start from the bottom and work backwards. All right. So at the bottom we have the Gender Inequality Index, which examines the difference between the male gender index and the female gender index to create a gender inequality index. All right. So the male gender index is made up of two different indicators. Okay, that is the male empowerment index and the male labor index. All right, and the male empowerment index is going to be education and parliamentary seats. The male labor index is going to look at participation rates for males in a country. Okay, that gives a male gender index number. And on the flip side, the female gender index, there's a little bit more that goes into it. We still have labor participation. We still have secondary education and share of parliamentary seats. But again, we also have health indicators that for men we can't measure. We can't measure paternal mortality rate during birth. We wouldn't do that. Okay, so instead we're looking at, okay, do women have access to high quality, trained professionals when giving birth, because that can be an issue when it comes to birth. There are complications. If you have a trained professional, they might be able to address those complications so that the mother doesn't die. A higher maternal mortality rate would be an indicator of a lower level of development. Same thing with the adolescent fertility rate. All right, a higher adolescent fertility rate typically associated with lower levels of development. And that gives a female reproductive health index. We combine all three of those. That gives us our female gender index. We compare that with the male in order to get the gender inequality index. Now, we're actually taking a look at numbers on here. Okay, this is the actual raw data for the gender inequality index. And I want you to note that the rankings that you see on the far left-hand side are the HDI rankings. Those rankings do not always equal the Gender Inequality Index rankings, which are actually, if you take a look at where the countries are, it's the second column in. That's the country ranking. So actually, the number one country when it comes to greatest gender equality, okay, meaning a low gender inequality rate, is Slovenia. Slovenia is number 25, so they're actually not even in this screenshot. They're number 25 on the Human Development Index, but they're number one when it comes to gender equality. All right. Now the U.S., we ranked 8th on the Human Development Index side. But when it comes to gender inequality, we ranked 55th. So, of the top 23 countries that you see here, these are the top 23 most developed countries on the Human Development Index. The U.S. has the highest maternal mortality rate of the countries that are seen here. We have the highest adolescent birth rate. And the U.S. has the third lowest percentage of parliamentary seats that are held by women. So for the United States, that would be the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, it would be a really good question. Does this take into account local government? Does this take into account state legislatures? And to that, I don't know the answer. Now, we said that the U.S. has the third lowest percentage of parliamentary seats held by women. Only South Korea and Japan are lower in this particular screen, which again is the 23 most developed countries. We ranked 8th on Human Development Index, but 55th on gender equality. And so when we take a look at this, this is our Gender Inequality Index map. Is gender inequality a good measure, a good indicator of development? When you take a look at this, is there a clear divide between MDCs and LDCs, between the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery? Is there a clear divide? And hopefully you said, yes, there is. So gender inequality is a good indicator of the level of development. But even still, the US, if we notice, the rest of the countries that we're typically compared with, Western Europe, Canada, Japan, Australia, we are much lower than those countries. So in terms of, if you were wondering, okay, we were 8th on Human Development Index, how can we get higher? Well, we could address some of those Human Development Index indicators. We could address some of those gender development indicators. We could address some of those gender inequality index indicators. All of those would seek to improve greater levels of development for the United States. The final metric for today is going to look at the gender empowerment measure. Okay? And this looks at how involved women are in actively improving their status. So being in a position to make changes. So when we take a look at this, we look at things like economic power. Okay? Female income as a percentage of male income. All right, being financially stable enough to be able to make those decisions compared to someone else. All right, percentage of professional and technical jobs that are held by women, percentage of administrative jobs that are held by women, percentage of parliamentary jobs that are held by women. Now notice on this one, it's national parliamentary jobs. On the last one, we said we weren't sure if that included state legislatures. On this one, it is not going to include state legislatures. It is only going to, for the United States, include the Senate and the House of Representatives. Percentage of those jobs that are held by women. So, if we take a look at this map in the bottom right, what observations do we have? Does the gender empowerment measure appear to be a good indicator of development? And you might be saying, well, I'm not sure. It's an interrupted map. We don't see all of the world. Like, we don't see much of Africa on this map because there's so little data. There's so many countries with no data. Hey, that's a big question that we have on here. Why is this interrupted? Why is there little data in many other countries? So we want to ask that question. Now, of the countries that scored, the Middle East actually scored the lowest when it came to gender empowerment, having women in a position to improve their status. So keep an eye out on the Middle East as we're talking about this. So taking a look at female income as a percentage of male income. All right. Again, what type of map do we have? Choropleth map, national scale. Is this a good indicator of development? Okay, there's a lot that's going on here, but take a look at the key. Notice that the highest class tops out at 84%. So that means that the top of this is female income topping out at 84% of male income. So it doesn't even go all the way to 100. So a question that I would ask, are there any countries that are approaching 100? Because again, this is a choropleth map, so we have this issue of induction that has to be addressed. You know, what countries are reaching that closest point? All right. Again, what areas appear to be more developed? What areas appear to be less developed? Using this as an indicator. Next one, percent of professional and technical workers who are female. Notice once again, this is an interrupted map. And again, is that because there's a lot of countries with no data? Perhaps. All right. So again, percentage of professional and technical workers who are female. Does this appear to be a good indicator of development? All right. Next one is going to be looking at percentage of legislators, senior officials, and managers who are female. So this is looking at administrative positions. Okay. This one we're starting to see, okay, looks like this is a better indicator of development. but still not perfect. All right. And our last one is going to be looking at percentage of seats in parliament that are held by women. Notice Scandinavia and Northern Europe. They have the highest percent of parliamentary seats held by women. Okay, of the developed world, I should say. Okay, but notice the corporate class. It still is only it starts at 30%. And we already know from our population unit that women constitute more than 50% of the world's population. And so that's a big reason why we're having this discussion, because these differences in gender do have an impact on levels of development. That countries that have achieved greater levels of gender equality, because remember, no country has truly achieved gender equality according to the United Nations. But countries that have achieved greater levels of gender equality are countries that are more developed. Countries where there's greater gender inequality are less developed. So in terms of trying to improve levels of development, because that's what this major topic is going to be for this unit, is improving levels of development, not just within our country, but around the world. One way to do that is to promote and improve gender equality. So we're going to talk about that in class. Have a wonderful night, everyone. We'll see you in next class period.